Please welcome to the stage Vice President for External Affairs, National Marine Sanctuary Foundation, Shannon Colbert.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Capitol Hill Ocean Week, and happy World Oceans Day. It's great to see many of you back in person today, and also welcome for those tuning in virtually on our platform from around the world. I'm Shannon Colbert, Vice President for External Affairs with the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation. And while many of us in this room and virtually who are attending have different missions and priorities, we all understand we have a common goal. We have a common mission and a common reality that we share of needing to make sure that we fight for a healthy planet, and that planet sustains us all. The waters of that blue planet are our lifeblood, and to address the climate crisis, we must all take a stake in the health of this planet and work together in order to protect our place in it. And we all know that. I know you all know that. And the experts who are joining us today and yesterday, they all know that, and they're addressing these issues in the ways that they can, given theirs, and looking for ocean solutions that can be climate solutions. But there are so many people out there that need to understand and think about how the ocean is part of who they are. Whether or not they live on a coastline or in the heartland or some other country around the globe, we all have a shared common purpose here. And we need to work on making sure that World Oceans Day is every day. So I ask actually a favor of each and every one of you on World Oceans Day to take up a mission of actually reaching out to at least one other person who you might not talk to about these issues or your priorities or the work that you do, but think about how we can all individually and collectively build bridges, how we can build awareness about the work that needs to be done, and that is the first step when it comes to connecting, to caring, and to acting. I think we heard very loud and very clearly yesterday in our sessions from our leaders that we need action, and we need to take the steps to get there. And so I ask every one of you, myself included, think about how we can get there together. And I'm grateful for each and every one of you that take that step today. So for Capitol Hill Ocean Week, that is a major part of what we try and do. We try and think about how we can connect people to our oceans, coasts, and Great Lakes. We try and think about how we can connect advocates, partners, and how we can drive that action collectively towards oceans, coasts, and Great Lakes conservation, and ultimately addressing the climate crisis together. And we could not possibly do that alone. And so just as we could not do that without all of you here joining us, as well as online, we could not do that without our supporters and the generous support from our sponsors. And so I want to thank again our signature sponsors, NOAA and the David and Lucille Packard Foundation. And I want to also thank our presenting sponsors, the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, Yamaha Motors and Yamaha Right Waters, and Finless Foods, and our many other sponsors and supporters that make this possible. It's thanks to that support that we can actually come here, convene, as well as make sure that we include everyone around the world virtually. And so I want to also say throughout the day, in your space here as well as online, please do think about the questions that you can ask our experts today. We want this to be a dialogue, and I would like to make sure that we have every opportunity to address those questions and have this be that dynamic conversation that we seek. So with that, I'd actually like to introduce and welcome Representative Seth Magaziner. He proudly represents Rhode Island's 2nd Congressional District. The congressman serves on the House Natural Resources Committee, where he's working to bolster Rhode Island's blue economy and protect the 400+ miles of coastline that that great ocean state has. He is supporting the development of responsibly sited clean energy, and he's also ensuring that Rhode Island's world-class fisheries remain healthy, productive, and vibrant for generations to come. So I ask you to join me in welcoming Representative Magaziner.
Well, thank you very much, Shannon, the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation, and everyone who is involved in putting together Capitol Hill Ocean Week. I hope that it has been a productive and illuminating couple of days. and I welcome you all once again to the nation's capital. I'm proud to represent Rhode Island's 2nd Congressional District, the home of the first operational offshore wind farm in North America. And taking a step back, in the Ocean State, in Rhode Island, we see firsthand the impact of climate change because we're living it every day. The Narragansett Bay, which is the economic and environmental center of Rhode Island and the geographic center of Rhode Island that has sustained our state for centuries, has risen 6 inches in just the last 30 years, a foot in the last 100 years. Changing climate, warming sea levels are already impacting the commercial fisheries industry, impacting coastal property owners, and impacting our economies. And it's the frontline communities that are hit the hardest. Today, this week in Rhode Island, just like here in Washington, we are having our worst air quality days in a generation at least, because of wildfires in Canada that are not supposed to happen this time of year. June is early for this, and it is, of course, a product of the warming and changing climate. So we are living these realities every day. They are impacting the health of our communities, the economic strength of our communities, our wildlife, our industry, and our quality of life broadly. But there are solutions and there are ways forward. Our state is leading the nation in the transition to clean energy, driven largely by offshore wind. We are the home to the first commercial wind farm in the United States, the Block Island Wind Farm, which has been spinning for about 5 years now, a 30-megawatt, essentially pilot project, but one that's had a real impact in our state. The town of Block Island, which I represent as part of my district, is an island that used to be powered entirely by oil, and now is powered entirely by offshore wind. The progress will continue from here. The proposed Revolution 1 wind farm is expecting its final regulatory decision this summer. That is a 700-megawatt project that would power both Rhode Island and Connecticut. And there's a new proposal for Revolution 2, an 884-megawatt project. And depending on who you talk to, if all of these projects, Revolution 1, Revolution 2, in addition to Block Island, go online as proposed, but depending on who you talk to, between 60 and 80% of Rhode Island's total electricity will come entirely from offshore wind within the next decade. That is a sea change for our state, which historically has been powered more than 95% by fossil fuels. So we can move responsibly toward a clean energy economy, a domestic energy economy that will lessen our dependence on bad actors around the world like Russia, and create hundreds and thousands of good-paying union jobs, powering thousands of homes with affordable electricity, and doing our part to combat the climate crisis. Importantly, the Rhode Island experience has also shown that it is possible to develop offshore wind in a way that is responsive to the concerns of impacted communities, whether it be commercial fishing, recreational, hospitality, tribal concerns, municipal concerns. It is possible to have a process that is inclusive and that brings people in early, which is the way to do it. Don't leave people out and try to ram things through, but bring in stakeholders early so that you have thoughtful plans for where offshore wind should be sited, and, when necessary, appropriate compensation for impacted industries and communities. This is the way it's worked in Rhode Island, where state regulators, in addition to federal regulators, have brought in the fishing community, brought in other impacted communities for feedback, for public comment, changed plans as a result, changed the spacing between the turbines, changed the siting of the turbines, in order to be responsive to those concerns. And then also ensured that, in particular, the commercial fishing industry has received fair compensation for any impact that they may incur. We should do this in a more systematic way as we build out offshore wind across the country. There are a number of proposals being developed in Congress now to earmark a portion of the royalties paid by offshore wind developers to compensation funds for impacted communities, tribes, and industries. This is a win-win for everybody. It will certainly be good for those impacted communities and industries, but also good for developers too, who will no longer have to negotiate one-off deals with impacted industries, but instead have a uniform process paid for by existing royalties. My hope is that we will see some action on this in the coming year in Congress. There is bipartisan support. There are multiple versions of bills already in development to do something like this. And if we can bring everyone together and reconcile around a shared vision, I think there's a lot of potential to make sure that we open the door for responsibly sited offshore wind all across the country while compensating impacted communities and industries in a fair way. So if you take one thing away from my comments this morning, it is that the Rhode Island example shows that this can be done. It can be done responsibly. We can do our part to make this clean energy transition a reality, to protect marine life, to protect commercial fishing and recreational fishing, to protect impacted communities, tribal communities, states and municipalities. But what it takes is this. What it takes is stakeholders with different points of view coming together, having tough conversations, doing the work, and aligning around a shared path forward. That has been the Rhode Island experience. We are proud to be leading the way on this. We are proud to have been the first, and we are proud to be on a path to be the state that benefits the most from this offshore wind revolution. But this is something that is going to benefit our entire country, our planet, and the generations to come. We just need to get together, have the tough conversations, do the work, and move forward in a responsible way. So you have my commitment as a member of the Natural Resources Committee on the House that I will continue to engage with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to advance smart, clean energy policy, to protect marine life, and to protect the communities, particularly the most vulnerable communities on the front lines of climate change. And I thank all of you for being a part of this work and a part of this solution. As I understand it, this group that I'm looking at right now encompasses everyone from academics to activists to private industry to government officials. I just noticed my friend and a true environmental leader, Janet Coit from NOAA Fisheries, is here, who does a phenomenal job and is a former Department of Environmental Management director in Rhode Island. Really exciting to see Rhode Islanders on the national stage always. But all of you are part of how we make this clean energy future, this sustainable future, a reality. So thank you all very much for the hard work that you are doing. Keep it up. We are making progress, and we are going to leave a legacy for the next generation that we can all be very proud of together. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Congressman. So for our first plenary of the day, 30 gigawatts by 2030, what is the future of offshore energy? We have an amazing panel that's going to talk about this administration's ambitious goal of deploying 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030 and what it's going to take to get us there, as the congressman said. We're going to be outlining some of the opportunities, but also the obstacles, as well as looking at how we can ensure equity remains a central priority as the U.S. strives to achieve this ambitious goal. I'd like to introduce our session moderator, Dr. Stephanie McClellan. She's the executive director of TurnForward. TurnForward is an independent national nonprofit organization dedicated to advancing the mission and vision of the American offshore wind power that meets today's climate, equity, economic, and environmental challenges. She has led offshore wind initiatives through philanthropic institutions, industry, as well as state government work, and she is a founder and former director of the Special Initiative for Offshore Wind. Stephanie.
Well, good morning. While our panelists join me on the stage and get seated, I just want to first say good morning and thank you, Shannon, for that introduction. And thank you to the National Marine Sanctuaries Foundation for hosting Capitol Hill Oceans Week and including this plenary panel on offshore wind energy. I don't know if the foundation or even the audience is aware of this, but a true U.S. ocean climate milestone occurred this week, Oceans Week and National Week of the Ocean. The first turbine of the Vineyard Wind 1 offshore wind farm was installed just yesterday off the coast of Massachusetts, marking the first installation of a turbine on the nation's first utility-scale offshore wind farm. That is in no way to minimize the Block Island wind farm that the representative just talked about as the nation's first offshore wind farm. But once built, Vineyard Wind as a utility-scale offshore wind farm will produce enough electricity to power more than 400,000 Massachusetts homes and businesses, reduce emissions, and bring benefits to the southern New England workers that are contributing to and now sharing in offshore wind's success. And it's certainly not just the Vineyard Wind milestone to note. Offshore wind more generally is at a historic point in the United States. The South Fork Wind Farm is also under construction this summer. The federal government is continuing to advance the permitting of many other projects in the queue and continuing to lease sea space for offshore wind, including in the Gulf of Mexico, marking the start of a clean energy transition in the heart of offshore oil and gas country. States are continuing to require utilities to purchase power from offshore wind farms, and supply chain investments are happening across the country. And again, reflecting what the representative just mentioned, more than ever, communities and stakeholders are engaging in and shaping what this new energy resource is going to mean and the benefits that it's going to have for us. Those who are working on making this opportunity a reality understand that this is a really, really big transition, as you all know. The urgency of needing large sources of clean energy and combating climate change is fueling the desire to progress offshore wind and to do so with haste. But there's also a strong recognition of the lessons of the past, that large-scale industrial transitions can have real human and environmental impact if they're not done right. And that recognition must be at the forefront of this build-out. That means we are trying at the same time to both move forward with haste and center a commitment to deliver offshore wind in the manner that its benefits can be felt in our communities, our marine environment, and our economy. And that's what TurnForward, the nonprofit advocacy organization that I lead, is working to make happen. And indeed, that's what everyone on this esteemed panel is working to make happen. And I'm so pleased to have these panelists with us today. NOAA Administrator, Dr. Rick Spinrad, Jocelyn Brown-Saracino, the U.S. Department of Energy's offshore wind lead, John Calvelli from the Wildlife Conservation Society, Tyler Studs from Golden State Wind and Ocean Winds, and last but not least, Kathleen Frangione from Ørsted. These panelists are here to engage in a meaningful discussion about what it's going to take to build up offshore wind and to build right. And over the next 75 minutes or so, what we're going to do is this. First, I will invite each of the panelists to the podium for their opening comments on their perspective on the future of offshore wind, the challenges in these themes. Second, we will dive into a discussion on offshore wind's clean energy opportunity, the challenges of realizing it, and what's actually happening to address those challenges. And we'll also delve into the benefits that offshore wind can deliver, as I said, to our economy, communities, and workers. And last, we will take questions from the audience. I believe that there's someone who's passing around cards for you to put your questions forward. And so it's an action-packed agenda, so we're going to get started and move to our panelist opening comments. And I'd invite Jocelyn Brown-Saracino from the U.S. Department of Energy to the podium.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. And thanks to you all for being here today. I came to the federal government through the Canal Sea Grant Fellowship Program. So this event is an event that's near and dear to my heart, and I'm really excited to be here with you today. I'm going to be doing a little bit of grounding for the group with respect to where we stand on offshore wind development in the United States, what our collective goals look like, and the efforts that we're taking to try to get us there just briefly before we dive into the other other remarks and then the discussion today. But just as a little bit of context for where I sit within the federal government, the U.S. Department of Energy supports advancements in the energy system of the future, and we do that through support of policy analysis, research, demonstration, and deployment activities. And we work really closely with our sister agencies, including the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, which is responsible for leasing in federal waters, leasing of offshore wind in federal waters, our colleagues at NOAA, our colleagues at the Department of Transportation and other federal agencies, as we take a whole of government approach to really trying to advance offshore wind in the United States. And of course, our partnerships don't end at the federal government. To begin, just a little bit of framing to kick off from where Stephanie started us with respect to where we stand on offshore wind development in the United States. We have 7 turbines currently in operation in the United States of 42 megawatts, but we have a pipeline of projects that has been in development and is growing with the support of so many actors. That pipeline is now over 50 gigawatts in size, and as Stephanie was mentioning, we've got our first commercial scale, utility scale projects under construction right now. The history of offshore wind development in the United States has really been marked by state leadership. And right now we have planning commitments from states in the United States for over 100 gigawatts of offshore wind, with 42 gigawatts of that being enshrined in law. And states and regions are really looking to offshore wind as they look to their decarbonization goals, they look to energy security, and they look to economic benefits. And it's really in light of both the promise that offshore wind holds with respect to the role that it can play both in regional and national decarbonization, but also the promise that it holds with respect to helping us revitalize coastal economies. That the federal government almost 2 years ago issued a national goal for offshore wind development, a goal of deploying 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030 while protecting biodiversity and promoting ocean co-use. And when we established that goal, we also indicated that reaching that goal could result in 110 gigawatts or more of offshore wind by 2050. And achieving the 30 gigawatt target could result in close to 80,000 jobs, including 44,000 jobs in the offshore wind sector itself, as well as about 33,000 jobs in communities that are benefiting from the economic development of offshore wind. It could generate enough power to electrify 10 million American homes and reduce carbon emissions by 78 million metric tons. Most of the development of near-term offshore wind in the United States is going to be fixed bottom technologies. But here in the United States, we also have an enormous offshore wind resource in deeper waters that would require floating technologies in order to be able to access that offshore wind resource. And so as we look to the future, there's also a lot of work underway to really think about how we drive towards US leadership in floating offshore wind development. And it's really in light of that this last September, the Departments of Energy, Interior, Transportation, and Commerce came together to launch a new floating offshore wind specific initiative called the Floating Offshore Wind Shot, which is an effort to really try to drive US leadership in floating offshore wind deployment, manufacturing, and design. And alongside that SHOT effort, the Department of Interior established a 15 gigawatt target for floating offshore wind technologies themselves, specifically by 2035. So today we're going to be talking about some of the progress that's being made on offshore wind. We're going to be talking about some of the challenges that remain as we seek to reach our collective goals. But here today, both at this event that is really focused on the nexus of climate and ocean, but also today, in this city that's blanketed by smoke, the work that we're doing here feels like it couldn't be more critical. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion today, and I'm looking forward to working with you all moving forward. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Spinrad.
Dr. Spinrad.
Thank you. And thanks, Stephanie, for teeing us up. I really liked your characterization of how we're at a historic time. I would say that this is an historic day for the reasons you just described. I'd add that it's actually a milestone week. CHOW, by definition, is a milestone week. We at NOAA are particularly proud some of the announcements that we were able to make with respect to coastal resilience this week make it a milestone. And it's a seminal era in terms of the thinking about climate change, both in terms of how we mitigate and how we adapt, and the roles that we have to play in the federal government. It's especially challenging, but also a wonderful opportunity in light of the fact that it's very fluid. Technology is changing. Economics and supply chain challenges, you're going to hear about that in a minute from some of the development community. And geographies around the country haven't seen this scale of activity and development in ocean co-use, at least in modern history. And so these all represent both opportunities and challenges. And for us at NOAA, we see a very important set of opportunities and also an increased focus on the responsibilities that we have associated with things like marine resource stewardship responsibilities. We have regulatory, environmental review obligations under the law. We also have operational responsibilities with respect to meeting the demands of these very, very important objectives. And a lot of times when I go out to audiences, they ask if I would come talk about 30 by 30, and I say, which one? And that's an important point to keep in mind here, whether we're talking about 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030 or 30% lands and waters conservation by 2030. And the two meet, and it's our job as federal agencies to make sure that we do this in a highly coordinated and complementary fashion. And so this concept that you've already heard twice, and you will hear many more times in the next hour and a half or so, about building out 30 gigawatts of energy while protecting biodiversity, while promoting ocean co-use is really important to keep in mind, juggling those balls, keeping everything in balance. So I'd like to spend just a couple of minutes talking about our responsibilities at NOAA, and also want to try to represent and talk about the relationship that we in the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management and Interior, BOEM, enjoy in terms of trying to work towards these very, very important goals. So we do work very closely in collaboration with Department of Energy, with BOEM, and also with BSEE for safety issues as well, with respect to siting, leasing, permitting. And in fact, we signed an agreement with BOEM back in 2022 to codify some of how we will move forward in the most effective management to both adhere to our responsibilities and ensure that we can move with alacrity and efficiency in the permitting front. And our partnership with BOEM actually goes well beyond the direct permitting and regulatory responsibilities. We have a really good partnership for doing things like harnessing marine spatial planning tools, for ensuring that our responsibility for fisheries survey, which we've had for over a century, is addressed in a continuous and sustainable manner to make sure that the economic viability of the fisheries industry is sustained in this dialogue as well, and also addressing our important issues with respect to marine mammals, endangered species like the North Atlantic right whale. So the development of a strategy, an offshore wind strategy, is directly tied to North Atlantic right whales, is an important component of what we have been doing. And I would point out that we're not just talking about this, we're not just writing up agreements, we're not just developing policy, we're investing. And in fact, many of you may have seen that in the announcement we made 2 days ago, we identified over $80 million worth of activity associated with research and monitoring tied to North Atlantic right whale mitigation of impacts and understanding the relationship between our statutory responsibilities and the development and the build-out of this critical and important economic sector for offshore wind. We're taking a very thoughtful approach. I would say we're trying to develop an all-of-government approach so that we're not in a situation where there's misunderstandings or confusion with respect to where roles and responsibilities lie. But in that spirit, let me share with you that from a NOAA perspective, we have full life cycle responsibilities in terms of the build-out of offshore wind. And if you'll bear with me, I'll talk about it kind of from the start. So let's talk about choosing where to put wind farms. First of all, you want to know where the wind is. Second of all, probably even more importantly, you want to know that the wind's going to be there in a few years. We talk about climate change. everything that we know. Past is not prologue when we talk about climate change. So what are the wind fields going to look like in 10, 20, 30 years? Then, of course, we are very concerned about minimizing and mitigating potential impacts to marine life, critical ecosystems, and ocean uses. We have statutory responsibilities, whether it's through Magnuson-Stevens or the Endangered Species Act or the Marine Mammal Protection Act. We also take very seriously our role of engaging with federal, state, local, tribal partners and the private sector. So we look to structures, mechanisms for co-development engagement, not throughout, not in an opaque manner, but in as transparent and efficient manner as possible. And then I've got to say that we also take very seriously our role for promoting safe and efficient offshore wind siting, build-out, and operations through the total life cycle. So operationally, as I'm sure you'll hear, considerations of how to optimize the performance and operations of wind farms is going to depend on critical environmental intelligence that we can bring to the table. I did want to say a quick word about the engagement piece because I think if our BOEM colleagues were here today, they would point out that they, as the permitting authority, have lead responsibility, for example, for engaging and consulting with tribes. We are committed to meaningful engagement. It is not a box-checking exercise. It is intended to be informative, dialogue in terms of transferring information in both directions, and especially engaging those most critically affected and involved communities, the coastal communities, fishing communities, tribal communities, make sure that we can ensure that the transition to clean energy is done in as inclusive and thoughtful as a manner as possible, and with full attention to the formal trust responsibilities that we do have to tribes. So I want to leave this audience with a sense of just how important that aspect of the co-use, co-development is as we move forward. As I said in a meeting with the President just about a year ago, where we met with developers, governors, and others, I said we at NOAA in the Department of Commerce are fully supportive of the goal of developing offshore wind energy while protecting the nation's resources and continuing these traditions, and I would say even expanding on the traditions of ocean's co-use. Balancing the different uses of the ocean is central to the concept of building out America's blue economy, America's new blue economy, and central to the concept of America the Beautiful. So we've already achieved, I think, a lot just in the last couple of years. We're in this incredible era of marine protections. I was chatting with folks a little earlier. We're in the midst of designation process for 6 national marine sanctuaries. We've never been there before. We're in the midst, thank you. And we want to do that in a way where we are also, don't forget, I work for the Department of Commerce. So we are driven by the economic development aspects of building out the offshore industry as well. It's a real challenge. We are up to it, and colleagues in the federal agencies, energy, interior, transportation, and elsewhere, and we look forward to building on the strong relationships we are developing with the developers, local communities, and tribes, and I welcome the opportunity to talk a little bit further about any aspect of that. Thank you.
Let's go to our developers now. I'll start with Kathleen Frangione. Okay.
Thank you. It's such an honor to be here today, and thanks, Stephanie, for putting together this great group. I'm Kathleen Frangione. I'm head of government affairs and market strategy at Ørsted Americas. We're really thrilled to be here partnering with Capitol Hill Ocean Week, and I really thank the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation for facilitating this important discussion today. I'll just take a minute because I know that some of you may not be familiar with Ørsted. We are a global clean energy leader. We're actually the world leader in developing offshore wind. We've been designated by independent parties as one of the world's most sustainable energy companies, which is a recognition that really informs the approach that we take on the way we develop our projects, and we'll be able to speak a lot about that today. We own and operate America's first offshore wind farm, which you've heard a little bit about today. I feel like tiny Rhode Island and the tiny Block Island wind farm continue to earn an outsized role in conversations about offshore wind, which we love. And it was great to have Congressman Magaziner here kind of carrying the flag earlier. In addition to that, we're proud to be advancing 6 commercial-scale offshore wind projects in the U.S. And really supporting the Biden administration along the way to achieving the 30-gigawatt goal. I would quibble a little bit, Stephanie, with the assumption earlier that Vineyard Wind will be the first commercial-scale project in the U.S. Of course, look, early days. Any victory for any developer is a victory for all of us. But I would say keep your eyes on South Fork Wind as we move forward. It'll be a battle to the end, and we'll be thrilled and cheering for all of our colleagues and partners, because we're very much all in this together with both our federal partners and state partners as we embark on this journey together. Quickly, in addition to our offshore wind portfolio, just to share with you all that we also operate and develop a broad set of onshore wind and solar projects. And we're also getting into the conversation around green hydrogen, which is really exciting. We've announced earlier this year a partnership with Maersk, the shipping company, to develop a green methanol plant in the Gulf Coast. So looking forward to really contributing to a lot of the conversations around decarbonizing the shipping sector through that work. So that's exciting too. At Ørsted, we're tremendously excited about the future of offshore wind in the U.S. And when it comes to the conversations that are happening here at CHOW, we really believe that climate solutions are ocean solutions. And we think that offshore wind has the potential to be the greatest ocean-based solution to mitigating carbon emissions nationally from climate change. And look, we realize we're early days, but we're excited to be helping to write this story here. And that means that we all together have the chance to shape the industry at the outset and really build it the right way, which for us means equitably, efficiently, and certainly while protecting the environment and the marine ecosystems. And I'm frankly really proud to work for Ørsted and proud of the approach that we take to responsible offshore wind development. I'll give you guys a few highlights on that, and happy to kind of get into more discussion, obviously, as we go on any of this. One point to underscore that I'm really proud of is our commitment to achieving a net positive impact on biodiversity for all renewable energy projects commissioned after 2030. So that's a commitment, kind of globally, corporate-wide for us to go beyond no net loss to find new synergies between offshore winds and ocean ecosystems. I'm also love to work for a company that's committed to equal opportunity in offshore wind. We have significant supplier diversity initiatives, and we're committed to using a skilled union workforce for offshore construction of our projects, which is just an important tenet to the way we do business here in the U.S. And I'm proud of the partnerships with academic and research institutions to gather and share better data and information about marine mammals and the ocean environment. We do an incredible amount of collaboration with the scientists and experts at NOAA, so it's fun to be up here with Dr. Spinrad today. And I'm excited that today, on World Ocean Day, we've announced our commitment to really a sustainable new blue economy. We're the first energy company to deploy blue bonds to finance sustainable ocean action. We just announced that this morning. And we also shared some news about a new unmanned surface vessel that we've developed and will be deploying to really collect as much ocean data as possible with minimal emissions to advance our work. So we really believe that these are the types of investments that can shape the future of offshore energy here in the U.S. And certainly, as we pick up the pace, I think the U.S. will emerge as a real leader globally in this space, which is tremendously exciting, and it's tremendous to have the opportunity to really build this industry the right way. So I'm excited for the discussion today and look forward to ongoing collaboration with all of you here on the stage and in the room. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen. Tyler? Tyler?
Good morning, everybody. I'm Tyler Stubbs. I'm CEO of Golden State Wind, Ocean Wind's newest project deployed off of, or soon to be deployed off of California's Central Coast. I will be brief to save some time. I just want to do a little bit of introduction to Ocean Winds as a company and our commitment to developing offshore wind as a tool to combat climate change. Those two things are things near and dear to my heart, marine conservation and offshore wind, and I'm really pleased to be here today, and thanks to the Marine Sanctuary Foundation for this opportunity. So Ocean Winds is an international company that's dedicated to offshore wind as a tool to combat climate change and the global energy transition. We're created as a joint venture of EDP Renewables and ENGIE, and based on the belief that offshore wind is a key tool in the global energy transition, we develop, finance, and build and operate offshore wind projects around the world. We're currently committed to that mission in 7 countries, and we have close to 17 gigawatts of a pipeline. In the US, we're currently developing 3 projects, both on the east and west coasts. We have our South Coast Wind Project in Massachusetts, Blue Point Wind in New York and New Jersey, and Golden State Wind in California. Ocean Winds has been a leader in floating offshore wind technology, which is what we'll be using in California to harvest the abundant winds off California in the waters that are too deep to deploy fixed bottom foundations that are used on the East Coast where the continental shelf extends far from shore. We've been active in floating offshore wind for over 10 years, and that's best embodied by our Windfloat Atlantic project, which has been operating off the coast of Portugal since 2020. So we bring with us a wealth of offshore wind engineering experience in the U.S. permitting regime, and we combine that with a set of commitments for how we work together with local communities, Native American tribes, commercial fisheries, as an essential part of our strategy for deploying offshore wind. So I think that what I like about what this panel today and what this conference is posing is a question of how can ocean conservation be used as a tool to combat climate change? You know, it's certainly something that is worth asking, and we take that question and flip it a little bit, is how can climate strategies be used to support ocean conservation? And our answer to that question is that offshore wind is a critical tool in the fight to address climate change, which poses a direct threat to ocean ecosystems. It's critical that we do this work. It's critical that we do this work in partnerships. So again, I'm really pleased for the opportunity to be here today to talk about this. There are many opportunities and challenges to deploy offshore wind and to realizing its value proposition to not only address climate change, but also as a tool to grow local jobs, to grow a local supply chain and local manufacturing. So look forward to talking more today about some of those opportunities and challenges and how we realize those.
Thank you, Tyler. John?
Good morning, everyone. I feel a bit, when you're the last speaker, like former Congressman Charlie Rangel. Everything has been said, but not by me. So I'm going to just talk very briefly about the Wildlife Conservation Society, who we are, a bit about a workforce, our workforce development program at WCS, and then just a few conversational policy suggestions that I know would probably pick up. So WCS, first of all, a big shout out to all of our colleagues here from the Association of Zoos and Aquariums and the Aquarium Conservation Partnership. People don't realize kind of the scale of the AZA and the zoo and aquarium community and the role that we can play. And the Wildlife Conservation Society sits in that space. We're a global conservation organization. We work in approximately 60 countries around the world, working in every ocean, every sea. But at the same time, we have these 5 facilities in New York, 4 zoos in the New York Aquarium. And as I was sharing with Dr. Spinrad earlier, we've already built the Hudson Canyon exhibit. So when Hudson Canyon is finally designated, it'll have a wonderful facility to highlight it. But we'll just leave that out there for conversation later.
We are the largest employer of youth in the borough of the Bronx. We're one of the largest employers of youth in the borough of Brooklyn. We're the largest employer of youth in South Brooklyn. So historically, we've played an outsized role in terms of hiring local youth. And as we think about that, we actually developed something called the WCS Lattice program. And I hate the name. I love my education colleagues, but it's really a pipeline, right? It's a pathway for opportunities. And when you think about that Lattice program, we at WCS alone have 300 internships. 100% of them are compensated. So that therefore we're developing these opportunities. 221 of our youth have actually identified opportunities within WCS, so they've moved up the ladder or the lattice. And 57% of those are identified as Black or Hispanic. And it's Pride Month, so I had to say 32% of those young people are actually LGBTQ+. So therefore, thank you. And last but certainly not least, we are a Tower of Babel, and there are over 30 languages spoken. So I share all of that because if we can do it, anybody in this room can do it. I say that sincerely. The fact is that we have, in some respects, figured it out. How do we identify workforce development? Now we've been working with the science-based cultural institutions in New York. There are 12 of us in New York. And what we've taken is something called the SIGN Network. And that network has now generated 1,100 STEM internships, paid internships in New York. 74% of those are from historically underrepresented communities. So the fact is, we're trying to do the right thing. Now, when we're doing the right thing, then of course it turns into how do we look at opportunities within this space specifically? And we were very fortunate because Congressman Hakeem Jeffries gave us an opportunity. I don't really remember the name. We used to call them earmarks when I worked on the Hill. Community-supported projects. Let me get that right. Community-supported projects. And the simple fact was, what we wanted to try to do was prepare teachers and youth for green STEM career opportunities of the future. We wanted to literally prepare them for what is happening. And we don't even know the scale of that yet. That research is being done. Numbers have said there's over 1,000 jobs, specifically in areas of ecological and biological monitoring. So, what have we done? Career panels, multi-day teacher, bringing people to the aquarium to learn more. But I think most importantly, and this happened just 2 weeks ago, so this is kind of real time, we convened 30 representatives from community-based organizations, environmental justice organizations, to talk about what does the future look like. And I think that's the thought I want to leave you with, which is that, we can be environmentally responsible while advancing economic justice and social equity goals. And I think that's really kind of key for me on this panel, but I know for so many in the aquarium and zoo community, this is important. We need to make sure we get it right this time. So I do want to leave with just a couple of policy suggestions and recommendations as we move forward. I think you've already heard these words already, jobs and whole of government, right? And you're going to continue to hear, I think, as we talk about it. Let me just posit that when we talk about a whole of government approach, we should probably have a whole of ecosystem approach as well. I'm a big fan of the whales. We care about whales at WCS. Dr. Howard Rosenbaum, many of you know the work, but there are hundreds of species that we're trying to focus on. So let's think about this a little bit more in an integrated fashion, number one. Number two, finalizing the vessel speed rule. That is an issue that we think will actually save a significant number of whales. And last but certainly not least, we need more money. I'll leave it on that note. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you all. We thought it was really important. I'll just say, to the audience, for you all to locate this diverse panel and where we all sit and what it all is that we bring to this conversation. And certainly you've teed up a lot of important issues in this. And where I want to start, each of you has touched on the need for offshore wind. And I just want to unpack a couple of issues before we start to get into the challenges, in developing that and sort of put put a finer point on perhaps a couple of those. And that is really, again, sort of this clean energy opportunity. You know, Jocelyn referred to decarbonization. We talked about the need for clean energy. Jocelyn referred to mentioning the state leadership in that. And I think it's always important, I think, for us to get out as we talk about this. You know, why does offshore wind have to be part of the solution? And I never want to pit other renewables against each other, right? There's a multi-technology companies that are represented on here. But why can't we do this, you know, without offshore wind? Why can't we reach our decarbonization goals without moving into the ocean with renewables? So I'll just open it up and see what you guys think. I'll ask another follow-up question to that, but just want to make sure that we understand the real need for this as you all see it.
I can kick us off to speak to that briefly and then turn it over to others. You know, we are going to need, as we look to our climate goals, both with respect to decarbonizing the electric system by 2035 and decarbonizing the economy as a whole by 2050, we are going to need a large and diverse amount of clean energy solutions. And it's hard to understate the scale of resources that we're going to need. And as we look to coastal regions, offshore wind is a really powerful tool in regions that have dense population centers, that can have siting constraints with respect to large-scale land-based renewables, and that can have siting constraints with respect to large-scale transmission. And so as we're looking to how do we decarbonize those coastal regions, and then how do we decarbonize the economy as a whole, as we look to clean fuel generation, offshore wind is really going to be a critical part of our energy mix in the future.
And just going to this issue of sort of the states have teed this up, and what you've heard here in both Kathleen and Tyler's introduction is that the Gulf of Mexico, California, and the East Coast, these companies are working on all of those. So can you talk a little bit about how those markets that you're working in are also seeing this? Jocelyn's laid out what the sort of federal view on it is. What's happening in the states as they see the need for this?
Yeah, that's great. Maybe I can talk a little bit about the East Coast, and then we can tag team West Coast. One thing I wanted to underscore, though, before I get to that point is that, and I think Jocelyn kind of laying out the opportunity, that's all completely on target. One thing that sometimes does get lost is that while obviously the generation will be off of the coasts, offshore wind is not just a coastal solution. I mean, for our projects alone, we've been able to trace the supply chain to 45 different states in the US and stretching into the heartland. You know, certainly the Gulf Coast is a critically important piece of our supply chain story, which I can talk about more later. So I don't want to leave the impression that this is only a coastal conversation. Of course, from a, you know, kind of policy conversation, that's often where it's driven, and that gets into the conversation about the markets. But the opportunity, the job creation, the economic development, that really stretches broadly throughout the U.S., which is terrific to helping us build longevity and durability for the industry. Stephanie, I think you mentioned this in your early comments, and Jocelyn, you as well, that the states have really served as the early drivers for the growth of offshore wind in the U.S. We are developing projects primarily in New England and the Mid-Atlantic, and we've seen governors and state legislators step forward with very ambitious goals for procurement of offshore wind, and then follow up those goals with setting, you know, reliable schedules and advancing procurement opportunities that developers like us are able to compete for, and that's been critical to creating the kind of long-term visibility that we as developers need, confidence in those pipelines, confidence that there'll be opportunities to sell into these markets for clean energy. You know, I'd cite state governments like Massachusetts, certainly Rhode Island has gotten a lot of love already today. New York, New Jersey, Governor Moore right around the corner in Maryland has just stepped out with a really aggressive 8.5 gigawatt goal for tiny little Maryland. And so the ambition is there, and we've seen states really continue to step up and set the structures and the procurement mechanisms in place to enable that. And I think we'll see that continue to grow as we move forward. And the partnership between the states and the federal government, you guys can probably speak to this better than I can, but we think that's where this all really just kind of hits really everything hits its stride when you've got the federal government able to partner with the state government and, of course, then with the developer and private sector community in building this out. And I think we're kind of at that moment, and it's fun to be part of.
Yeah. Before we get to California, John, you had a comment.
I just wanted to comment, Kathleen. What's really interesting is New York State, just to show a little bit of love for the great state of New York, they've taken this policy conversation to the next level. As a New Yorker, try to get a natural gas hookup right now. You cannot, right? Why? Because there has been a decision that electrification is the way to go. And I think one of those incredible examples of that is going to be the new JP Morgan Chase building, which will be fully electric. So that is the future. I mean, policy is now driving why we need this. We need ocean wind.
That's right. And I mean, New York has been a standout leader in this regard. We love all our children equally, of course. But, and so much of this really is, of course, aggressive climate goals, specific offshore wind goals, electrification goals, but also the jobs and supply chain aspect of this industry, and the opportunity there has been such a focal point for Governor Hochul. Her commitment to creating a supply chain based in New York, giving opportunity to New Yorkers, is advancing this conversation so swiftly as well. So it's great to be able to see kind of all of the pieces coming together there.
Before we go to California, Dr. Spinrad?
Let's go to California first.
There we go, California.
Well, I think to build on what was already been said, I think certainly applies for California as well. And I will maybe add as well that one of the key features of offshore wind is not only its quantity and abundance as a resource, but its quality when it is generating when it's needed most. That's true on the East Coast in the cold winter months when natural gas-fired generation is constrained and can drive up price spikes. That also happens to be when offshore wind is generating the most and has the most value. That's equally the case in California, where solar energy is waning at the end of the day when the sun is going down, just when offshore wind energy is peaking. So it is a complementary resource that is going to play a critical role as a part of that broad suite of renewable resources. So California has a goal of being carbon neutral and carbon-free electricity by 2045. Offshore wind is going to play a really critical role in doing that, and we see similarly state leadership driving that. The state committed to a planning goal of 25 gigawatts by 2045. That is a huge lift, but it's something that is, we're starting to see a lot of leadership from the state to help to realize that through AB 525, a piece of legislation that was passed that is setting the state on a trajectory towards preparing and planning for offshore wind. And it's needed because, as was already mentioned, electrification, the state has massive electric vehicle goals. So in addition to the retirements of fossil generation and the soon-to-be hopeful retirement of the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant, the overall load will be increasing. So that's the perspective on California.
Thank you. Dr. Spinrad.
Yeah, I want to put a little bit of an asterisk on this conversation. It comes back to the way you framed the question, Stephanie, and point out that, yes, we are here to talk about offshore wind. Yes, we are here to talk about the ocean's role in climate. And most of what we're talking about is in the mitigation agenda. It's in renewables, it's in decarbonizing. There is also a very important role the ocean plays on the adaptation side as well. And as evidenced by the administration's publication of an Ocean Climate Action Plan, in which we talk about renewables, but we also talk about things like marine carbon dioxide reduction. And so those are not separable arguments. And in fact, one of the fascinating things fascinating aspects of this discussion, I think, with the developers is how might we use the build-out of offshore wind and wind farms as a means, for example, for positioning monitoring capabilities that could help contribute to a marine carbon dioxide reduction agenda as well. So let's think about this holistically.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really very important point. And I, again, thank you for sort of, illuminating that. I do think sometimes in conversations about offshore wind, especially in environments perhaps where people are less familiar with it, they'll think it's just some new Biden administration federal program and don't know what is really driving it at the state. Thank you for bringing up building electrification. It's electrification, it's climate, it's where are we going to get this resource from. It's also the constraints on land for, in these very, very, heavily populated load centers. And again, it's a very integrated, sort of strategy, not just one thing that we're trying to accomplish here. So let's, again, as I said in my comments, and certainly have been alluded to by each of us, so this is a big, huge transition, though. Tyler said 25, that's a big lift, right? This is a big transition and certainly not without its challenges. And so getting 30 gigawatts of offshore wind projects in the water by 2030 and the next build out, beyond that is a big and hard transition. And so, let's first talk about, here in Oceans Week, the need to ensure the protection of marine and coastal resources as we undertake this build out. And so, I'll just say when TurnForward, we launched at the end of 2022, we did so with polling about, American support for offshore wind in coastal communities. And offshore wind was wildly, positively supported by coastal residents. The number one concern that they have, though, about offshore wind, marine mammal protection and bats and birds and bats. And so, I think this is a good place to start when we talk about that challenge. How do we do this right? And Dr. Spinrad, I'll just ask you from your perspective as the NOAA administrator, how does NOAA view this challenge and what do we need to do to get right? You referred to the North Atlantic Right Whale rules and strategies, but what is it that we need to get right as a community?
Yeah, thank you for that. And I would say that, again, as a science-based organization, one of the most important things we need to do is get the right science upon which to frame the questions. Make sure we understand what are the priority questions. So I mentioned the issue of addressing our responsibilities for management of fisheries, which requires us the capability to do stock assessments. If we start looking at changing how we do stock assessments, there's a question of scientific credibility. So you do it one way for 100 years and then you change the way you do it because we are considering placement of wind farms or other considerations. We have to have a scientifically viable way of saying this is the stock assessment today as comparable to the stock assessment we did last year. The other part of it also is making sure that our statutory responsibilities associated with things like endangered species and marine mammal protection are framed in ways that allow us to get the best answers to questions like exactly how many North Atlantic right whales are there, where are they now, where are they going to be, and can we get that information into the hands of decision makers to make important decisions, not just about placement or siting, but also about operational approaches. And so it's all going to end up being scientifically based. For us at NOAA, I think a lot of the challenges are about basically resourcing up to answer the questions. The developers have a time frame, a time scale that is the speed of business, if you will. We have a time frame that is the speed of government. How do we get these married up together? So I'll give you just one example. One of our busiest offices is our office up in Gloucester, GARFO as we call it, Greater Atlantic Region Fisheries Office, where if you went up to GARFO about 5 or 10 years ago, you would have seen 1 or 2 people responsible for dealing with the permitting issues. Now we're having to scale up to almost 60. And so just getting those people in place to deal with the volume of decisions and permitting decisions and coordinating with our colleagues in BOEM and Department of Energy means we've got to work aggressively while we're doing the business of managing fisheries day to day anyway. And so consequently, staffing, resources, coordination, and collaboration, understanding the business operations and the business plans of the developers is part of that as well. So it is, to some extent, somebody characterized it a little bit like building the airplane while you're flying it. And there is a little bit of that. Rest assured, we're doing it safely. And I would just close out by saying the last part of it is dealing with what, quite honestly, many times are volumes of misinformation, dare I say disinformation. And so working with the people in the know, with the developers, with the communities that I alluded to in my comments, to make sure the best scientific information is out there for people to understand. So the public who says, yeah, we like that, but we understand there may be concerns associated with impact on whales, we can turn around and say, in fact, the best science suggests that's not the case. Here's what we need to do to get that information to you and make sure you're better advised with respect to these kinds of concerns.
Absolutely. Thank you. John, anything to add to that?
I was just kind of thinking about the job perspective, and I feel like I'm going to play that role on this panel. We talk a great deal about the manufacturing opportunities and the construction opportunities. You talk about permitting. There's also the ecological and biological monitoring opportunities, and there hasn't been as much in that area. And for us, you know, I'm a child of immigrants, and we want to make sure that those opportunities are there. And there's going to have to be work done over the next 2 to 4 to 6 years to make sure we have that pipeline or that lattice available. So I just want to make sure, as we're thinking about these issues, we don't forget that.
Yeah. Kathleen and Tyler, I mean, from where you sit, you know, these critical issues of making sure that you both have mentioned it, but just is there anything that you want this audience to know about what you're doing as it relates to this marine mammal protection and making sure that we do this right as we build this out?
Sure. Yeah, it's a incredible area of focus and prioritization for us. So we appreciate the opportunity. We also appreciate the challenge that, you know, NOAA and all the federal agencies are having and adapting to working with developers as we're advancing all these projects. And, you know, please continue the dialogue. You know, we know our teams are in touch on a daily, if not more frequent basis. And we're certainly continue to support increased resources flowing to the agencies to help with this, because we recognize as more and more projects are being developed and advancing, you know, there's going to be more commitment, not more commitment, but just more time and effort that's required on the part of the agencies. So thank you for that, and we'll continue to do our part there. I think one thing that's important to know about offshore wind projects is that there are a number of protections that are in place for our industry that are stricter than exist for a number of other maritime users. So this is an area that we spend a lot of time, focus, attention, and there's arguably more kind of rigor and requirement in place for offshore wind than there is for many other industries. Just some notes: speed restrictions, use of protective species observers on our vessels, limitations certainly on when survey and construction activities can take place based on marine mammal habitat needs, and that's something we obviously take very, very seriously in collaboration with all of our federal and state permitting partners. And at Ørsted, we are really excited about how we can use technology to do all of this better. I know that's an area of enthusiasm that we share with you, Dr. Spinrad, and there's areas of investment that we're making that we look forward to continued collaboration with our federal and state partners on how we can build some technology advancements into the permitting structure, into the way we do business, so we can get better and better at this as we go. Just a few notes on that. Eco-PAM, which is something that a lot of folks in the room are probably familiar with, passive acoustic monitoring systems focused on North Atlantic right whales, is something we're making significant investments in. Also thermal imaging as a method for auto detection of marine mammals is another area of focus for our company. So lots of ongoing opportunities for collaboration there, and it's something that certainly we as developers can't do alone. The federal government can't do alone. And again, I think the theme of partnership is one that we'll continue to pick up through the conversation.
Thank you. If I can add one other comment too, since we're talking about climate change as the driving force behind a lot of this, we also need to consider the uncertainty with respect to things like distributions of those species as we see climate change. There are some very important scientific questions right now about what may be driving the populations of whales off the east coast of the United States. And so part of this is making sure we're doing the research that, if you will, looks forward kind of passes the puck to where it will be in terms of trying to understand what are the consequences of climate change as they may manifest 5 or 10 years from now, in terms of our ability to monitor the ecosystem and especially the marine mammals.
Yeah.
And just to pick up on that, I mean, I think collaboration is the perfect word. And I think we have to be thinking about this, you know, between all of us. And from an acoustic monitoring perspective, WCS has been working very closely with the industry on that. And also, more importantly, there's a feedback loop. That information is also available at the aquarium, so that the communities themselves can learn more about what is happening. So that's an important feedback loop as well. I do appreciate the words, Dr. Spinrad, regarding looking at kind of, as I said before, this whole of ecosystem approach. I mean, I think obviously we care about North Atlantic right whale. It's important, but we need to be thinking about all the species that are impacted by the work that's being done there.
Tyler, anything to add on this?
Yeah, I think that I'll say that it's our responsibility and commitment to do good science, and also that the offshore wind industry will increase the understanding of the marine environment. We'll generate a lot of data. We've seen that already through projects. We've seen that through public investment in data collection. And also there's structures that support collaborative and jointly scoped research that are critical. We're seeing that on the East Coast, and there's efforts to stage that up on the West Coast. So together, those things are going to be really critical tools to help make sure that we're ensuring conservation of marine mammals and other species in the marine environment overall.
Great, thank you. And while I was leafing through the big stack of questions that we're getting, and a lot of the questions that are being asked are exactly what it is that we're talking about here, so I'm glad that we're on point. I will say there's, you know, my next set of questions is on the additional challenges, right? Just, you know, this is but one of many challenges, right, in this big transition. Transmission, supply chain, addressing costs, and I've noted that there are questions about that in the audience questions, and so I think I'm going to do is to save that topic and then direct it, answer them directly to the audience questions, and move into this discussion about benefits, right? So I mean, we've kind of covered, you know, here's what the need is. We've got to have offshore wind. We have to move into the ocean to do this. It's got, you know, this major challenge that a lot is being done on. Some of the questions were around misinformation. Some of the questions were around how does industry work better with the federal government to address these issues. But now if we sort of switch and really talk about, besides the clean energy benefit, you know, the other reason why the states have embraced offshore wind, as Kathleen and Tyler have said, is the opportunity, right? And I think if we, you know, just to put some numbers on it, the Special Initiative on Offshore Wind in 2020 looked at what the economic or what the capital expenditures would be to just build out 30 gigawatts by 2030. It's $130 billion of capital expenditures that will be incurred to build out this. And you know, so what does this mean for American workers? I think, Jocelyn, you talked about the 80,000 jobs. But when we talk about really going into local economies, and I'll maybe, you know, direct this to John and to our developers, you know, what are kind of opportunities are we really talking about here? How far do they extend? Into what communities? And you know, and then we'll get into how are we making sure that we're centering equity and inclusion and justice in that opportunity. So I'll just open that up for whoever would like to start.
I will tell you that, and it's the asterisk, it can be transformative, or it cannot. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I mean, you know, it's a choice that we will make, and many of the people on this panel will have that ability. As an organization that is headquartered in New York and that is a major conservation organization, where DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, is kind of at the core of who we are and the values that we're trying to promote, we're kind of advocating, as one of the reasons why I wanted to be on this panel, to make sure that we don't lose sight of that opportunity. From a New York kind of institutional perspective, from a municipal perspective, we need this energy to continue. I mean, we've closed our nuclear power plant in New York. We need it. Now, having said that, the economy in New York has gone through, it goes through peaks and valleys. This, I think, will be one of those opportunities, especially in places like South Brooklyn, depending on where these opportunities come out. But there are still pockets of poverty, and this can be truly transformative. But again, with that asterisk next to it.
Yeah, I think that's right, John. I mean, it really does take commitment and focus to the communities where we're building these projects. There is incredible potential. We are really excited. I'll talk a little bit about a program we just launched in Atlantic City, New Jersey, a few weeks ago, which we call Wind Power Ready. Our first iteration of it is in Atlantic City, but our ambition is to expand this to other locations.
I know a few
where
places
we're building
that
our
we could
projects.
do.
You've got some ideas for me? Good. We'll talk after. But this is particularly focused on turbine techs, which is a career track that doesn't require an incredible amount of education or past training, and is one that's very high paying, but accessible to people without that sort of established background. And we want to hire turbine techs from the communities where we're building these projects. And so we launched this program in Atlantic City, which is where our operations and maintenance hub will be located for our Ocean Wind 1 project, our first project in New Jersey. And really looking to source those turbine techs from the local community, kind of disadvantaged community that typically isn't, kind of in the midst of the energy industry, and really hands-on working with community partners on the ground to figure out how we can bring those folks in. It's incredibly exciting, and but it does take focus and work, and we're committed to it. I wanted to give you guys a sense, because I know a lot of this seems maybe a little bit kind of down the road or abstract, but just to say, I mean, I joked about the kind of competition to be the first commercial scale project, but these jobs they're here today, and as these first two and many more kind of immediately down the road are starting to advance, the jobs are here. So we did our onshore transmission work for South Fork, which is kind of last year and into this year, now complete. 100 union jobs in New York were created doing that work. The offshore substation for our South Fork project was constructed down in Texas. It's actually the first offshore substation that's built here in the US. And there were 350 workers that were involved in building that. And now as we're moving into kind of assembly and soon-to-be installation work for South Fork. That's kind of hundreds of jobs, both New Yorkers as well as other kind of working out of other ports in New England, supporting all of that. So these are real. They're here today, and the focus and the attention needs to be put looking forward to make sure that we're doing exactly what you're talking about, John, and bringing the communities in, making sure that this is an industry that, since it's new and we have the chance to do this right, that we really are doing it, and we're excited about participating in that.
The one thing that I want to just say about South Fork Wind Farm, it's 130 megawatts of offshore wind project. And that kind of number of jobs. So sometimes people will hear, 300 jobs, 400 jobs. That's 0.1 gigawatt. Yeah. We're talking about 50 gigawatts. Yeah. So, I mean, I just want to put it in the place. Yep. It's a big project, and it's going to be so much bigger. So, I'm sorry, John. Dr. Spinrad,
Yeah, I want to talk, your question was about economic development. Yeah. And we're talking in the near horizon, I would say, in the, say, 5-year, 7-year time period. There's an economic opportunity well beyond that, and it's associated with what we're calling the new blue economy at NOAA. And another way to think of this is the climate industrial complex. It's a service-based industry, and that is to say that our ability to collect information about the ocean and use that information to inform decisions is going to depend on industries, robust industries' need for that information. So right now, think of how the insurance and the reinsurance industry uses that kind of environmental intelligence. The build-out of the offshore wind industry will create a market for that new blue economy, that information-based economy. And by some estimates, the climate-based services economy is expected to be anywhere between a $100 billion and a $1 trillion economy. Compare that to the $10 billion commercial weather enterprise. So this is a real tsunami of economic development that we're going to see supporting a range of markets, including offshore wind.
John.
And I just want to share, I mean, as we're thinking about this, let's ensure the engagement of Native American communities like the Shinnecock Nation, as we're thinking about, obviously, from our perspective, as we're thinking more about Hudson Canyon, et cetera, we want to make sure that all communities are engaged. And I kind of smile and I think about economic opportunity and political will and diversity in all of its forms. One of the great things that we've found is that we've actually been able to bring Democrats and Republicans together, so that this is not being seen as a Democrat or Republican, conservative or progressive approach. This is really all elements of the political body. And I think let's not forget that as well. And I think that is a really incredible opportunity we have to move this process forward.
And I'm very glad that you said that, because I do think that one of the things we really have to just make sure as we move forward, past this next couple of years, is how do we make this a must-have, not a nice-to-have? That's right. That it's not one any particular administration or governor or political party's agenda, right, but that this is actually a part of what it means to build out this new energy landscape.
John's absolutely. Gigawatts are not red or blue; they are purple.
Exactly. Exactly. Okay, so I'm going to, in the interest of time, go to the couple of questions that dealt with a few of the other challenges that we have here. And I'm going to first take a look at transmission. I'm actually going to, this is both a state and federal issue, but I'm going to start with you, Jocelyn. What is happening as it relates to transmission? This is obviously a really new thing that we're trying to do here. So can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So as we build out offshore wind, there's going to be a range of transmission challenges that we're going to need to resolve as we're thinking about the first generation of projects. We're thinking about ensuring they have points of interconnection, that we're doing the land-based upgrades to the transmission system that's needed to connect them to the grid. As we look to scale up offshore wind, we need to be planning for shared transmission in the future, and we need to be doing that with a marine spatial planning lens. So thinking about how we build transmission in a way that considers both the environment and ocean co-users. And there is quite a bit of work being done right now to help plan the transmission systems of the future for offshore wind. Just at the Department of Energy alone, we're doing work in partnership with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management to both analyze what future offshore wind transmission topologies might look like, to convene stakeholders around those options. We're going to publish soon, in partnership with BOEM, an action plan for how we might develop transmission on the Atlantic, and we're also turning our eyes to the West Coast. We're kicking off similar efforts there as we think to enabling floating offshore wind and large amounts of grid penetration there. And certainly the work of the federal government is not the only work that's being done there. States are actively planning for transmission solutions in the future. And then one other area of focus is also the R&D that's needed around transmission in the future. So at the Department of Energy, we're supporting work around HVDC, high voltage direct current technologies that can minimize electricity loss over long distances. We're doing work there. And then as we look to the future and we look to floating technologies, we're going to have some unique transmission needs there with respect to floating substations and dynamic array cables. And so quite a bit of work to be done in the transmission space, but also quite a bit of work underway. And I just might close by adding that through the bipartisan infrastructure law, there are also some additional resources to help support the development of new transmission, support the resilience of the grid, including DOE has $13 billion in funding on the street now to support activities like that.
Yeah. Anything in markets, especially on the East Coast, Kathleen, that you might want to add?
Yeah, just one thing I'd note that I think particularly maybe the funding that you just mentioned always does facilitate collaboration. It's been exciting to see kind of states in New England particularly interested in how kind of federal funding might be able to help them think more long-term about what their transmission needs are and how that can be facilitated. So we're really encouraged to see that sort of collaboration again between the states and the federal government. It's so important to us. I feel like transmission is one of these issues that we talk about a lot. It feels like it shouldn't be so hard. There's some technology issues, but a lot of it is about like planning and questions about who pays, which are fundamentally policy questions. And so kind of getting all the different actors to be focused on, kind of the challenges and working to resolve them is critically important.
I'm just going to borrow from, I think you said, we love all of our children equally when you were talking about projects. A question, what do you see as the greatest barrier to offshore wind development? We love all of our barriers equally. I'm not sure that there's a greatest one. So I'll just throw that out if there's an answer that you guys would have to that as the panelists, but just specifically around supply chain and port infrastructure. The current port infrastructure is insufficient to meet the 30 gigawatts by 2030 goal, let alone create tens of thousands of American jobs. How can we close the funding and supply chain gaps to really build this out? And so the private sector has a role in that, the public sector has a role in that, and so I'll open it up to whoever would like to start.
Yeah, I fully agree. I mean, the question is fundamentally correct. We exist within a global supply chain right now. There's high demand for offshore wind components driven in large part by European markets. So, we're not immune to those pressures. That is further to the point of the need to invest in building a domestic supply chain to catch up with that demand, and ports are fundamental to that. They are key pieces of infrastructure that are purpose-built for offshore wind. They require large spaces for laying down components, heavy loading capacity for lifting those components, and in the case of floating offshore wind, doing those construction activities in port. Importantly, also, they are the focal points for jobs and economic development. That is critical. It's not surprisingly, it takes a long time to develop those specialized ports, and we need to really begin to do that now. And we need to do it in a way that's not necessarily going to be always done through competitive solicitations for power purchase contracts. It has been done on the East Coast, and essentially having those costs be borne by ratepayers. I think that there is the need for creative state solutions, creative federal solutions to enable that infrastructure development now, so that it can be ready when these projects are ready to be delivered, and that we can begin to foresee the job opportunities and supply chain opportunities, so that when those projects are built, they're being built with domestic workforce, they're being built with a domestic supply chain.
One thing that I would add there is, I think critical to developing the supply chain is going to be certainty with respect to the pipeline of offshore wind projects and the future of offshore wind development in the United States. And through both additional resources from bill and IRA, like additional funding to the Department of Transportation's Maritime Administration Port Program, which supports port development, but also through some of the tax credits, the extension of the production tax credit and investment tax credit, but also new manufacturing tax credits. I think we have some important tools with respect to both incentivizing manufacturing, but also helping shore up some of the certainty in terms of long-term policy certainty in terms of development.
Great. And so with just a few minutes left, and I will speak for myself. I will be able to speak with folks afterwards if there are questions, and perhaps some of our panelists can hang around as well. There are some additional questions on here that we won't be able to get to. But again, I think we've covered much of what is in here. But just in terms of, what we've laid out here again, to just kind of keep recapping, right? We're going to need this resource. This resource is coming. It's coming online soon. There's many challenges. There's lots of work going on around the challenge that extends to state and federal and local governments, which we didn't talk about today, to stakeholder engagement, to the transmission issues and the supply chain issues, and making sure that we're building this right. And so what are your takeaways for this audience? What do you want them to walk away knowing about this build out? And also, what advice would you give to them in terms of how they can help, how they can be a part of this? The one thing that I'll say is, we've talked about the whole of government. You said the whole of the ecosystem. I will also say the whole of the sector. This is going to take a whole of sector approach. There's a question here about what happens if we don't reach these goals, right? I'm not even going to entertain that question because we're going to meet these goals, right? Not to be disrespectful to the questioner, but it's going to take this whole of sector. It's going to take civil society and advocates, state, federal government, and the partnership between them, the industry itself, and and as I said, civil society and advocates like ourselves. So how can folks here be involved? How is it that they can be most effective to help out? No.
I hate to do it, but I'm going to throw it all on you. It's in your hands, right? That you're here, and the people that are watching this, this idea of advocacy, right, of engaging with your local elected officials, with your government officials. We talked a little bit about, I mentioned very quickly the vessel speed rule. That's an issue, if we do care about marine life, that we're going to have to be engaged in. There's been a lot of movement on that on Capitol Hill literally in the last 24 hours. But that, conceptually, it's about advocacy. We can create the future that we want. Right? If we talk about diversity and equity and inclusion but do nothing, then nothing will happen, right? So at this point, we're trying to lead by example at WCS, and we need other institutions and organizations across the country to do the same thing, and in a good way, put pressure on our government officials to make sure that and our colleagues and our business partners, right? Because I don't see these, we're not adversaries, we are collaborators. Yeah. And I think they're going to be looking to us to say, okay, what do we need to do to make sure that these projects are effective and have the local support, and that's going to come back to us and to all of you. Yeah.
I will build on that to say that offshore wind can be built and operated in a way that helps to realize the goals of marine conservation. We have a lot of work ahead of us in permitting projects. We'll be doing good science, ask folks to really see the value proposition that offshore wind provides to help realize the goals of marine conservation, and that we are doing that work, and that we're working towards common goals.
Yeah, and I really see us here at this moment at an inflection point where we're going from planning for offshore wind into the reality of offshore wind. And I think that comes with both the economic opportunity that we've been talking about, but also a learning opportunity with respect to really understanding from this first generation of projects, what are the impacts, how do we work to both in an adaptive fashion ensure that we learn from those projects as we work to develop the next generation of projects. And you know, it is going to take, I think we touched on some of the challenges and some of the work that lays before us, and we have an enormous amount of work to do to move forward here, both with respect to offshore wind, but with respect to the broader climate question. And it really is going to take the work of all of us assembled to get here. And it's for me, you know, walking here through the smoke, it's hard to not feel like that is our collective call to action. This is an incredibly important thing that we're all working on. How do we transition our energy system, but how do we do that in a way that's just and sustainable?
And this is the year that this all becomes real in this country, right? This year, 2023, is when you're going to have commercial scale projects installed and producing power. So it's an incredibly exciting moment. And I really do feel, though, that not a lot, it's amazing to see this room and know that there's a large group online participating in this conversation. It really is going to take the kind of collective work of us and so many partners to kind of share the story, to share the opportunity, the promise of doing this right, and to bring that home with you. I mean, I spoke about how, you know, a lot of people think this is a, you know, Northeast thing. 45 states are, you know, contributing to our supply chain for our company alone. And so this, you know, just sharing the story, getting political leaders at all levels engaged and enthused and involved is a critical piece of the puzzle, and a way that everyone in this room can help. And we're happy to be partners in that however we can.
Yeah, and I'd add, get the word out and get the feedback in. And I think, speaking as one government representative here, there's a lot of good stuff out there available for the public to understand, from policy, from science, from monitoring information. Help get that word out to people who may have questions or concerns. But also, we need your feedback. We need to understand what the concerns are. Yeah. People do that pretty well. We get thousands of comments in public comment period, but we welcome that. We'll send it all into ChatGPT and get it all.
And I will just add to that, to be critical consumers of information and push back on disinformation, especially at these particular moments. So, so again, we are 2 minutes over time here, so thank you for your indulgence of us, Shannon. Thank you very much for your attention. I want to thank all of you. I want to thank you not for your participation today, but for all the hard work that you are doing. It's going to take all of us, and I look forward to the continued journey with you all. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Definitely.
Stay seated.
Hope that served your
Sorry, folks.
needs. And hope that served your needs.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all for joining us for this session. It was an amazing conversation, right? These are groundbreaking pieces moving forward. So I just wanted to say, like, it's great to see the conversation on the infrastructure and the key needs. It was wonderful. Thank you for mentioning those breakthroughs for the commercial wind industry, and also that a success for one developer is a success for all. And I just want to make sure that we also say, the one piece that I'll say is that recognition of working with communities and that engagement as stakeholders, but also recognizing with sovereign nations, making sure to do that engagement really well. And that is on top of everything else that they are doing. So that is a piece that I wanted to reemphasize. So I appreciate all of your work on these fronts. So thank you.